Hello, everyone. Welcome back to Introduction to Mind and Will. This week, we're going to conclude our discussion of functionalism. We're going to specifically see some objections to functionalism from Ned Block. All right, so recapping the idea, last week we saw that functionalism is just the view that mental states are identifiable with functional roles. Okay, so that means that this view, unlike the others we've seen, isn't really focused on constitution, right? Constitution being what the mind is made out of, right? So a mind is not just a mental substance, like Descartes alleged, nor is it just a brain, like we saw J.C.C. Smart arguing, right? But importantly, it's not just observable behavior either, right? Behaviorism is the other view that we saw that isn't so much concerned with constitution. Okay. Functionalists rely on inputs, behavioral outputs, and the transformations between their inner states to define mental states. So what separates a functionalist then from the behaviorist is that they include in their view this sort of the intermediate between a sort of stimulation input and the behavioral output. Right? They take into account the intermediate process as well. Okay, so thus you're in a particular kind of mental state, right? Putnam, we saw last week, talked about pain quite a lot, but it goes for any mental state. You're in a particular kind of mental state if, given a particular kind of input, certain changes follow probabilistically from one kind of inner state to another. This may at times result in external outputs like behavior. Okay, so as Levin notes then, this means we now get to ascribe mentality to all kinds of things, right? We saw Putnam point out last time that one problem that the identity theory is going to have, right, where identity theory just is that the mind is identical with the brain, that a mental state just is a brain state, right? One problem that they are going to have is that not all brains are like ours, right? One, there are major differences between our brains and the brains of other species. And two, there's going to be differences in the way brains operate between humans, between you and I, right? So if you want to say that being in pain, as just an example of a mental state, is just having this kind of brain state, well, now you're going to end up throwing away a lot of behavior or appearance of pain, right? It seems like octopi can experience pain. Seems like I want to ascribe the mental state pain to them. But because they don't have the same kind of brain states as me, it seems like that's not possible. There seems to be something wrong about that. And functionalism addresses that challenge. They say, no, we're only looking at the functional role at work here, right? Going from that input, in the case of pain, to be something like a noxious stimuli, right? Like a burn or a sting or something like that. Something noxious, something you want to avoid, right? So receiving that kind of input, processing over that input, and there being some kind of output. Typically in the case of pain, it would be like a desire to avoid it, perhaps some actions involved to avoid the noxious stimuli. So functionalism gets us the ability to say, no matter your constitution, so long as you act in the right way, right, so long as you go through these kind of functional processes, you get to have the mental state. All right. This means minds aren't just going to be limited to animals. There might also be the possibility for extraterrestrial minds or perhaps inorganic minds, right? So robots, for instance, you might have something like AI if functionalism is true. Can't really have AI if identity theory is true. A robot, given that it can never have a brain, right, presumably, at least in an organic way, cannot have a mental state. That's just how identity theory works. Not the case for functionalism. Okay. So for functionalists like Putnam, the mind is something like a computational machine then, right? An input is received. Then, according to the current state of the machine and the rules that it's supposed to abide by, the machine provides a specific output or a probability of outputs, right? Sometimes those outputs are just an update of the current inner state, and sometimes those outputs include behaviors. This kind of functionalism, then, as Levin mentions, is called machine state functionalism. This is the big one. There are two other kinds of functionalism that get discussed. Attend to those in the Levin article, but machine state functionalism is by far the largest part of the view. When you're talking about functionalism within the philosophy of mind, most of the time you're talking about machine state functionalism. Okay, so here comes Bloch, right? Ned Bloch is going to argue that functionalism sees behaviorism as being too liberal. Being too liberal in this context means that you apply mentality too far, right? You give mentality to too many things, or your view could give mentality to too many things. So he's saying that functionalists see behaviorists that way. Behaviorists are giving mentality to too many things. Well, how is this the case? Well, remember, behaviorists think that mental states just are behavioral states, and perhaps dispositions to behave given certain inputs. Well, functionalists incorporate all of that as well, but they also include, in addition, the machine's inner states and the rules for transitioning between those inner states, right? So what that means is the functionalist is more or less a behaviorist plus more, right? But that plus more is going to mean that fewer things for the functionalist get to be labeled as mental, right? If it takes more things to be considered mental, you're going to end up having fewer things that get mentality. So the behaviorist, as far as the functionalist is concerned, is going to end up being too liberal and allowing for a lot of mentality. Okay. On the other hand, functionalists find views like identity theory, that we saw Smart express, for example, to be too limiting. Bloch uses the term chauvinist here, right? Why is it chauvinistic? Well, it's because there are many different kinds of constitutions, right, that can achieve these functional roles. It might be that mammalian brain can experience pain, and the brain of an octopus can experience pain, right? These two things aren't the same, but they can express the same functional role. Going for something like an identity theory is going to be too restrictive. It's going to be too restrictive. It doesn't allow enough mentality, right? So functionalism, then Bloch is suggesting, sees itself as this kind of middle path, right? You have, on one hand, behaviorism, which is far too liberal. It's giving mentality everywhere. Anything that appears to have some kind of behavior in response to stimuli, and perhaps dispositions to behave, that's a mentality, right? That's a mind. On the other hand, you have identity theory, which says, no, it's not a mind unless it has this specific kind of brain state, right? Far too restrictive. So the functionalist is somewhere in the middle, right? They found the sweet spot. Okay. Bloch's goal is to argue that that is not actually the case. That may be what the functionalist wants, but in fact, they can't get it, right? He's going to argue that functionalism is too liberal. It's far too liberal. So the same charge that they make of the behaviorist is going to be true of the functionalist. We're going to see why. Okay. So to make his case, he invokes some conceivability arguments, right? A conceivability argument is more or less, you can imagine this being the case. And if it were the case, it would show you some truth, right? It's sort of like a thought experiment. Okay. So the first one, the idea is that you can imagine a body that's exactly like yours on the outside, right? And all appearances and all functionality is exactly the same as your current body now. Okay. The only difference that this body has with yours is that instead of having a brain in its skull, it has a sort of control room where there are billions of little people, homunculi, right? That's what a homunculus is, are hard at work, right? So they're constantly looking at this screen that displays a symbol that tells them what the current state is, what the current state of the organism is. Each one of them has its own little rule, right? If the display has the signal that they're attuned to, and a certain input is received by the system, they're supposed to go over and change the state, right? They're supposed to go over and change what the screen says, right? So in doing this, all of these billions of homunculi are capable of representing the functions that your brain performs. That's the idea, right? An input happens. There's some kind of stimulation, right? They look at the screen. The one that's responsible for reacting when that symbol is on the screen and that kind of input is received goes over and presses their button, right? The state changes and we keep going forward, right? Outputs get generated accordingly. So they mirror the way that your brain is supposed to work, okay? If that's possible, if that's conceivable, rather, Block wants to say the functionalist is going to have to say that the homunculi-headed robot basically is exactly like you, right? It has a mind exactly like yours, okay? Why? Because the functionalist doesn't care how the mind is actually constituted. All they care about is that the functional role is achieved, right? That this function is actually carried out. To be in a mental state is to have the right kind of functional roles in play. Well, it seems like the homunculi-headed robot has that. So in all senses, then, this would be like a perfect replica of you. Yeah. Block wants to say, obviously, that's wrong, right? If you get to that conclusion that a homunculi-headed robot has mentality, then something's gone wrong with your view. But maybe the situation's too far-fetched, right? Maybe it's not possible to conceive of billions of little homunculi in your skull, right? Okay, so he tries to make the example more feasible, right? Something we can imagine actually being physically possible, even though still a little far-fetched. This is where we get the Chinese nation problem, okay? So why the Chinese nation? Well, it's because there's a lot of people there. There's a lot of people in China, right? And he needs, in order to build up a facsimile of the brain, which has billions of neurons, he needs a lot of people, right? So that's why China. Okay, so he wants to say we can use the individuals within the Chinese nation to do the work of the imagined homunculi in the last case. To make this work, every person in China is going to have to play their own particular role, right? When they see a certain symbol or a certain sign, given a certain input, they should do a certain thing, right? So they each have their own particular role. The input and the current state of the system are going to be displayed to everyone simultaneously in the Chinese nation by these low orbit satellites that will display the symbols necessary, and they're each equipped with these two-way radios so they can communicate with the others that are necessary to communicate with in order to carry out their functional role. Okay? If that is possible, Block wants to say, then they can more or less achieve the exact same thing that the homunculi were, or the exact same kind of functional role that your neurons are, right? So when an input is given to the system, which is the Chinese nation, right? The relevant individuals within the nation, those are the ones that, when the symbol indicating the current state of the system is what it is now, and this kind of input is what it is now, they're the ones that are supposed to respond, right? So it's only, you never have all of your neurons responding. You never have all of the possible functions going off, only the relevant ones, right? So some few individuals within the Chinese nation immediately get on their two-way radios, right? And it propagates throughout the nation according to these rules that have already been set in place, okay? Eventually, those communications reach the person whose job it is to update the current state of the system. So the low orbit satellites get rearranged. And there we have it. The Chinese nation seems to have gone from an input, something from the outside, transformed the inner state of the system according to some rules that are already there. And in doing so, they have updated the state of the system. And further, Block argues, they could very well radio in some instructions for this empty-headed robot, right? This instruction could tell the robot what to do, right? So you could get behavior as well. Okay, so what's the point? What's the point of the Chinese nation example? Well, it seems like through all of that elaborate means, the Chinese nation, if functionalism is true, would have mentality. Now, that doesn't mean that the individuals within the Chinese nation have mentality. That's fine. That's not controversial. The Chinese nation itself would have mentality, right? As a class, Chinese nation itself would be a mental state, right? In achieving this functional role, the Chinese nation would be a mental state. Now, that seems very peculiar, right? It seems very odd to say when you have people performing in a certain way, arranged in a certain way, they themselves can become a mental state. So for this instance, this brief instance of this functional role being carried out, it would be in some sense appropriate to say that the Chinese nation itself, not the people within it, but the Chinese nation itself was somehow thinking. Okay? Bloch maintains that this could even be carried out over an hour, right? So it's not like there was just one thought that disappeared like a flash in a pan, right? No, you could even have the Chinese nation being fully mentally present for an hour, right? Okay. He considers a few objections to this example, like, for example, neurons function much faster than it would if the Chinese nation were operating according to these two-way radios. He more or less blows these objections off, saying these are just practical details. Functionalism doesn't say anything about how fast the thing needs to be carried out, just that the function is carried out, which is true, right? Functionalism in and of itself doesn't say you have to achieve the function in such and such time. It just says the function has to be fulfilled, right? Further, as Bloch suggests, we can think of mental processes being slowed, right? Being slowed either artificially or maybe some mental processes just are slow. So being slow doesn't necessarily lead to the conclusion that there's no mentality there, right? He considers a few other objections, but none of them are very hard-hitting. Okay, so Bloch's conclusion. He thinks that it is wrong to say that the Chinese nation can be a mental state, right? It's wrong. No matter how perfectly they collaborate with one another, there is something wrong in saying that the Chinese nation is a mental state or can be one. In other words, functionalism, just like they were alleging of behaviorism, is too liberal. It gives too many things the possibility of being mental, right? It extends the term mentality to too many things. But if functionalism is too liberal, then that means we're missing something, right? The functionalist said that the behaviorist was too liberal in ascribing mentality because they did not include these inner states, the rules, and the inner states and the rules from transitioning from one inner state to another, right? Behaviorism did not include that, and that's why they were too liberal. So what is it that the functionalist is missing that makes them too liberal in their ascriptions of mentality? Well, Bloch suggests that what they're missing is that mental states have a certain kind of feel to them, that they have a certain kind of phenomenological quality. If that sounds familiar to you, there's good reason. After all this time, going from dualism to behaviorism to identity theory and now to functionalism, it seems like we've circled all the way back around again to Nagel, right? We're all the way back where we started. So what separates the homunculi-driven robot or the Chinese nation for people like Bloch and Nagel from things that have actual mentality is that there's nothing that it's like to be a homunculi-driven robot or a Chinese nation, but there is something that it's like to be us. Okay, so what we see then, after all this work has been done, is that it's clear we're not going to be able to settle the mind-body problem without looking into this deeper notion of phenomenal consciousness, right? If phenomenal consciousness is a robust phenomena, as Bloch and Nagel are suggesting that it is, then we cannot solve the mind-body problem while ignoring it, right? The functionalist might not be able to offer us a very clean solution to the mind-body problem because they don't seem yet, at least in the forms we've seen from them, to account for this kind of phenomenal quality of experience, right? It might also be the case that the identity theorist cannot account for this kind of phenomenal quality of experience. But then on the other hand, there are philosophers out there who do deny that there is some what it's likeness to our experience. So now going forward, we're going to look at these arguments, right? We're going to start looking into these arguments about phenomenal consciousness. Next week, we're going to return to Nagel, who's going to try and motivate the idea, yes, in fact, there is something that it's like to be you, right? But until then, stay healthy, stay safe.